The ancient Persians accomplished something few peoples in history have managed to do. Originally just a scattered group of tribes, they united and transformed their lands into one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. Unparalleled luxury, immense wealth, breathtaking beauty, and refined sophistication in every aspect. Ancient Persia could have felt like a fairy tale to many travelers. But within this fairy tale existed strange rules, rituals, and taboos. We know about them from the writings of Herodotus, the notes of Greek envoys, Babylonian cuneiform, and Zoroastrian texts. What may seem frightening to us today was considered perfectly normal in Persia. In ancient Persia, death was not the end. It was the beginning of a procedure, and not a symbolic one, as in many religious traditions, but a thoroughly practical and strictly regulated process. Among the Zoroastrians, who were the dominant religious group in Persia before the rise of Islam, there was a clear prohibition against polluting the elements. Earth, water, fire, and air were considered sacred, and a dead body, by definition, was a source of impurity. Therefore, burying it in the ground or burning it on a pyre was viewed as a crime against the cosmic order. When a person died, their body was not buried. Instead, it was taken to the top of a circular stone tower called a dakhma. These structures can still be seen today, for example, in Yazd or near Sari. On the flat rooftop, the bodies were laid out naked, strictly separated by gender and age. Men in one sector, women in another, and children in a third. No crosses, no tombstones, no names. Just a stone circle and birds. The main goal was to allow the body to be consumed. Scavenging birds, primarily vultures, were regarded as beings through whom impurity was carried away from the world of the living. The process was swift. Within a few hours, only bones remained. Once the flesh was gone, the remains were pushed into a central pit, where they slowly decomposed. The bones, notably, were not buried. They simply lay in the pit. Rainwater would also flow into it, helping everything that had once been human to dissolve and disappear. Zoroastrian culture was deeply obsessed with the concept of nasa, corpse impurity, which they believe spread with physical precision, from skin to air, from breath to home, and from home to everything around it. To combat this impurity, they didn't use prayer, incense, or salt, as was common in places like Egypt. The primary cleansing agent was bull's urine. Known as gomez, it was considered not just pure, but a sacred liquid capable of destroying the very force of evil, the druge. And this wasn't metaphorical. These rituals were carried out literally. The deceased body was washed with this liquid. Anyone who had contact with the dead also washed. If a person touched the corpse with their hand, they had to be doused with bull's urine 3 times, accompanied by the recitation of special formulas. Performing this rite in silence was forbidden. Impurity might hear and hide. The urine was collected in a strictly regulated manner from specially designated bulls raised in temple herds. These animals were not allowed to work the fields, mate, or suffer any physical injuries. They were, quite literally, living vessels of holiness. Even after the body had been placed in the dakhma or left to decay in the accursed pit, remnants of the person were still seen as sources of impurity, especially hair and nails. These seemingly harmless remains were viewed as traps for evil. Because they didn't decompose quickly and could last for years, Zoroastrian belief held that they retained the memory of the body, and therefore, its impurity. They couldn't simply be cut and discarded. Every haircut, especially after death, became a ritual. Hair collected from the deceased was burned in a separate fire, not in the temple's sacred flame. The same was done with fingernails. Before burning, they were washed with the same bull's urine to separate the evil from the substance. Then, they were placed on special pottery shards and set alight until not a single strand remained. The fire used for this ritual was not allowed to come into contact with any other sacred objects. Zoroastrians feared that even a single unpurified hair entering the fire could defile the flame itself. In that case, the hearth would need to be reconsecrated, priests summoned, and a 3-day restoration ritual performed. Some texts even provide specific warnings. If hair or nails entered water, that water was not to be drunk, bathed in, or used around the home. It had to be poured out onto barren ground or evaporated. In this way, even in death, a person's influence on the world persisted and had to be controlled down to the very last trace. For Zoroastrians, water was more than just a natural element. It was a living being, a divine feminine essence known as Appa. If this essence was defiled, especially by a corpse, blood, or impure discharge, it had to be purified immediately. Water that came into contact with death was considered sick, and if not healed, it could begin to die itself, literally lose its vitality, fail to nourish the land, and cause disease and drought. The mere act of a corpse entering a river, whether by accident or intent, was treated as a serious offense. This was especially grave when it involved a great water, a major river revered as sacred. In such cases, a special purification ritual was required. It could last anywhere from 3 to 9 days and involved priests, a clean fire chalice, ash, and bull's urine. The priests would approach the riverbank, burn dried plants, recite sacred formulas from the yasna and vendidad, and then pour the purifying liquid into the river, always downstream. Sometimes water was drawn out into vessels, cleansed outside the river, and then returned. According to the vendidad, anyone who threw a corpse of a dog, human, or even an unsanctified nail into the water deserved to be punished with lashes. The Persian Empire was renowned for its strict approach to justice. Its laws regarding punishment were marked by both severity and a sense of fairness. In Persia, it was believed that no one should be executed for a first offense, and that all of the accused's good deeds should be taken into account when passing judgment. Every criminal deserved a punishment proportionate to their crime. However, once guilt was proven, the Persians showed no mercy to those who truly deserved to suffer. They devised some of the most brutal and ingenious punishments in history. The most terrifying form of execution in Persia was neither swift nor theatrical. Contrary to the stereotype of the East as a realm of axes and scaffolds, the Zoroastrian legal system deliberately avoided the shedding of blood. Killing, even as a form of justice, was considered a serious violation of the elemental order. Blood was not to touch the earth. The condemned would be placed in a narrow, enclosed space, most often a pit or a stone chamber with no exit, sometimes with food, but never with water. Death came slowly, through thirst, suffocation, or isolation. The idea was that the criminal should dissolve without a trace, leaving no stain on fire, water, or earth. This method wasn't reserved only for murderers. It was also used for religious apostates, heretics, those who lied under oath or touched a corpse without permission. Even for minor offenses, such as the loss of ritual purity, a person could be sentenced to short-term isolation, so they could outlive their impurity. No public executions, no vengeance, only a strict adherence to Asha, the cosmic order. The world had to be restored to balance, even if slowly and unseen. In ancient Persia, justice was seen not merely as a function of the state, but as a manifestation of a higher cosmic order. When it was discovered that one of the chief judges, a man named Sisamnes, had accepted bribes, King Cambyses II decided to deliver a lesson no one would ever forget. He aimed to make Persian courts a symbol of fairness and impartiality. To ensure that the next judge wouldn't repeat Sisamnes' mistake, Cambyses staged a brutal example. After Sisamnes was executed, his life ended under the executioner's axe. Cambyses ordered his skin to be flayed from his body. That skin was then used to upholster the very chair the judge had once sat in during court sessions. But the most striking part of the story was who sat in that chair next. Cambyses appointed Sisamnes' own son as the new judge. Each day as he sat in that chair, he was reminded of the price his father had paid for his greed. In this way, Cambyses ensured the unshakable integrity of the judiciary. Among the most gruesome and elaborate forms of execution in ancient Persia was slow suffocation in ash. This punishment took place in a specially constructed tower, massive and hollow inside, standing about 20 meters tall. The tower would be filled with ash, not hot, but caustic and fine, easily inhaled into the lungs. At the top of the tower was a platform. The condemned would be thrown down into the ash. While the fall could cause injuries, it was not meant to be fatal. That was by design. The victim was meant to die slowly, through suffering. A special wheel-driven mechanism inside the tower stirred the ash, sending clouds of fine dust swirling upward into the throat and lungs. In such conditions, the person could not breathe, and any movement only hastened suffocation. Death did not come from the fall, but from the gradual filling of the lungs with ash. This cruel form of punishment became so infamous that echoes of it reached even biblical texts. In one passage, a wicked priest is said to have been executed in this exact manner, with his family denied the right to bury his body. The fate of Roman Emperor Valerian is one of the most humiliating chapters in the history of late Rome. Captured in 260 CE by the Persian king Shapur, after a failed military campaign, he became a living symbol of the enemy's ruthlessness. Valerian was kept in chains and forced to march in front of the Persian armies, proof of Shapur's glory and Rome's downfall. But the most degrading humiliation came in another form. Every time the king mounted his horse, he would step on the former emperor's back, using him as a human footstool. The end was even more horrifying. When Shapur finally grew tired of using Valerian in his displays of dominance, he ordered his execution. Molten gold was poured down the emperor's throat, turning his death into a gruesome and symbolic spectacle. Among all the known forms of execution in ancient Persia, one stands out for its horrifying ingenuity. This was not a punishment for ordinary criminals, but for those the state deemed personal enemies of the king. It was used rarely, precisely why it became forever etched into the chronicles of human cruelty. The condemned was stripped naked and placed into a wooden contraption, either a hollowed-out tree trunk or between two tightly sealed boats. Only the head, hands, and feet remained exposed. The rest of the body was enclosed. Then the ritual of torment began. The person was force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until their digestive system began to fail. Within hours, the body was soaked in its own excrement, and fluids began to seep from wounds and skin folds, attracting insects. Honey was smeared on the face, limbs, and torso. Swarms of flies, wasps, and other insects quickly descended. Bites, crawling, larvae infestation, and inflammation turned the body into a living, rotting shell. But the execution wasn't just about pain. The victim was continually fed by force, day after day, to slow death and prolong suffering. The mind usually broke before the body. Some began hallucinating within just 2 days, losing their grip on reality. Nevertheless, physical death came agonizingly slowly. According to ancient sources, one victim of this punishment survived in that state for 17 days. In ancient Persia, religious leaders, the priests, were not only spiritual guides but also politically influential figures. Yet one story turned their lives into a living nightmare. A priest named Smerdis deceived the people into believing he was a son of Cyrus the Great and seized the throne through fraud. Surprisingly, Smerdis turned out to be a capable ruler. He introduced tax reforms that eased the burdens of ordinary citizens and relaxed military service laws. But once his deception was uncovered, it sealed his fate. After his execution, the fury of the people turned against all priests. Mobs stormed the streets, slaughtering anyone belonging to the priestly class. When the bloodshed ended, the Persians decided to commemorate the event annually. Each year, on the anniversary of Smerdis's death, a festival was held. People poured into the streets, and if any clergyman dared to appear in public, he would be brutally killed. The day became a symbol of hatred and popular vengeance. In ancient Persia and neighboring regions, brutal punishments for rebels were commonplace. Maiming an enemy while keeping them alive was seen as an effective way to humiliate and instill fear. When a rebellion broke out against King Darius, he resolved to crush any future thoughts of defiance. He subjected the leaders of the uprising to a torturous fate. They were mutilated, had their tongues cut out, one ear removed, and were left with only one eye. But death did not come immediately. The rebels were chained to the gates of the royal palace, turned into living symbols of punishment. Everyone who passed by saw them and felt the weight of royal authority. For weeks, these men remained exposed, suffering insults, beatings, and unbearable pain. The grotesque display served as a chilling reminder to anyone daring to challenge Darius's rule. In ancient Persia, a person knew their place from birth and knew they could not rise above it. Everything was built on obedience, the young to the old, the poor to the official to the king, and the king to the law. To break this order was not just disobedience, it was a disruption of the very structure of the world. That's why education, service, and even punishment were all integral parts of the system. Harsh, ritualized, and absolutely clear to everyone. In ancient Persia, child-rearing was approached with strictness and seriousness. Until the age of 5, boys were raised in the women's quarters, and more notably, their fathers did not see them during this time. This was done to prevent the father from forming an emotional bond with a child who might not survive infancy. Among Persian men, 2 traits were especially valued: bravery and fertility. Herodotus even notes that the king would sometimes reward fathers of large families with special gifts, recognizing their contribution to raising future generations. Many customs of the ancient Persians might still be seen today as admirable and just. For example, boys were taught from an early age to master 3 key skills: to be excellent horsemen, to shoot with great accuracy, and to always tell the truth. The Persian people despised lies and liars. In ancient Persia, there existed agricultural labor camps where unfree farmers, mardu, were bound to state-owned land. They weren't considered private property like slaves in Greece, but they also weren't free. They had no right to leave their plot, change professions, or refuse to work. These laborers were relocated in groups, often to inhospitable or newly conquered lands, swampy areas, salt-ridden fields, or the fringes of irrigation canals. There, they lived in primitive settlements under the watch of officials, with no access to temples, courts, or religious rites. They worked from dawn until dusk, regardless of age or gender. Women and children pulled plows alongside men. They were not paid wages but received fixed rations, grain, oil, and worn clothing from government stores. Fugitives were branded or tied to a post in the center of the camp. For acts of sabotage, they could be beaten, or worse, reassigned to a dead zone, where the work was heavier than the available food. The bodies of the dead were not buried according to Zoroastrian customs, as these people were considered ritually impure. They were simply dumped in the earth or thrown into dried-up canals, treated like discarded material. For the Persians, impurity was no metaphor. It lived in breath, in blood, in the shadow of the dead, in a piece of raw meat, in a word spoken with the wrong tone. An ordinary person might not notice it, but for a Zoroastrian, it was already a breach of cosmic order, and if that order was broken, it had to be restored at any cost. Not through repentance, but through action. To cut it out, drive it away, rename it, marry it off, even if the marriage was repulsive. One of the most unusual and disturbing rituals in Zoroastrianism was kavatukta, a sanctioned union between close relatives. In some cases, this meant marriage between a brother and sister, a father and daughter, or even a mother and son. The practice is mentioned in Zoroastrian texts such as the Bundahishan and Denkard as permissible and even pleasing to the divine under certain conditions. The purpose was to preserve the purity of the faithful bloodline and to strengthen the righteousness of the family. It was believed that if both parents followed the truth and performed rituals properly, the child born from such a union would be doubly blessed and pure. This type of union was seen as a shield protecting the order of Asha from external corruption. It was especially relevant among high-ranking priests and members of the spiritual elite, where such marriages were rare but fundamentally acceptable. In Zoroastrian Persia, a name was far more than a label. It connected a person to the cosmic order. Through one's name, priests could summon the soul during rituals. It was inscribed in purification formulas, and it marked one's clan, craft, and faith. If a person violated the law, especially a spiritual one, their name was considered defiled, and thus it had to be destroyed. The punishment of forced renaming was applied to apostates, heretics, those who broke taboos on contact with corpses, entered false marriages, or refused to offer sacrifices. The individual would be officially stripped of their former name and forcibly assigned a new one, often disgraceful or animalistic, rotting one, cursed, nameless, son of a dog. This new name was entered into public records and everyone was required to use it, neighbors, judges, and officials. Even family members, under threat of punishment, were forbidden from calling them by their former name. At the head of this entire system stood one man, the Shah. He didn't merely rule, he embodied Asha, the cosmic order itself. His body, his voice, his name, Even his shadow were considered sacred. To breach the proper distance was to disturb the world's balance. And if anyone crossed that line, they weren't merely punished, they were erased from reality. At the Persian court, looking the Shah in the eyes was forbidden, not as a gesture of respect, but as a form of protection. The Shah was not an equal. He was believed to be chosen by Ormazd, linked to the divine order, and the gaze of an ordinary person could defile his presence. Even those closest to him, generals, scribes, priests, spoke to him while looking at the ground or the wall. Exceptions were rare and always highly ritualized. According to Ctesias, a guard who once accidentally met the king's gaze was immediately executed without uttering a word. He wasn't killed for insolence. He was killed for crossing a boundary. The Shah was the center of power, and one could not approach him directly, not physically, and not even with the eyes. Even artists who painted royal portraits didn't work from life. They were given verbal descriptions or clay casts. Even the Shah's death followed strict ritual. His body was never displayed, his face remained covered, and his name was not spoken for several days. For to look upon a dead king was considered just as dangerous as looking at the living one without permission. In Persia, destroying an enemy didn't end with their death. The true goal was to erase every trace. No grave, no name, no mention in any record. If someone was declared a traitor, a blasphemer, or cursed by the state, the verdict came with an order to remove their name from all documents. Archivists would cross out lines, destroy tablets, and chisel inscriptions off stones. If the name appeared on temple offerings, the vessels were shattered and engravings scrubbed away with sand and acid. If the person had built a house or tomb, it could be leveled to the ground, so no physical form remained that might preserve the name. This wasn't done only to political enemies of the Shah, but also to rebellious priests and at times, entire families deemed guilty of disturbing the cosmic order. Such a sentence extended beyond the written word. Neighbors were required to forget the name, relatives forbidden from speaking it, and anyone who uttered the cursed name in conversation or prayer could themselves be accused of violating Asha. Zoroastrian belief tied one's name to one's very existence. If the name was destroyed, the soul would be unable to cross the Chinvat Bridge, its path to the afterlife forever sealed. Thus, erasing a name was not just a political punishment, but a sentence beyond life and death. In Persia, a system of blood vengeance existed in which the responsibility for punishing a murderer fell upon the victim's closest relatives. This was not a private matter, but a component of the legal order, codified in Sasanian legal texts, such as the Matakani Hazar Dadistan. The family of the slain had the formal right either to execute the guilty party or to accept compensation, typically in the form of livestock, silver, or land. However, compensation was allowed only with the victim's family's consent. If the relatives refused to pursue vengeance or seek justice in court, they themselves could be held accountable for allowing impurity to continue. The law viewed an unavenged killing as a breach of both ritual and social balance. If the guilty party fled, the victim's kin would swear an oath in court, pledging to carry out vengeance. This oath was recorded in legal documents and could be inherited. Some families conducted searches for decades, and this was not seen as a personal vendetta. Rather, the duty of revenge was considered part of the legal machinery for restoring Asha, the rightful cosmic order. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next videos. And be sure to check out our other videos where we explore the most mysterious and dark pages of history.